from Bersin Associates, and I will be moderating today's session. The presentation will last approximately 45 minutes, followed by a question and answer period. Before we begin, I would like to mention just a few housekeeping items. Audio for today's session is via your computer speakers. If at any time you are unable to use your speakers, please use the dial-in information on the left side of your screen. The Q&A session will begin after the presentation, but feel free to enter a question at any time during the webinar. Simply type your question into the Q&A pod on the left side of your screen. The voice over IP and phone lines will be muted during this session, and this webinar will be recorded. And now it's my distinct pleasure to introduce Kim Lamoureux, Senior Director and Principal Analyst, and Charles Handler, Adjunct Analyst here at Bersin Associates. And I will now turn it over to Kim to kick off the discussion.
Great. Thanks, Wendy, and hi, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to come today. I'm really excited to be able to make this presentation. This is really our first, I would say, big research effort in the area of pre-hire assessments, and we'll discuss at the end of the presentation what's to come. But this first presentation is based on the primer, which was published today, and we're going to walk you through a number of different aspects of that primer. But before we do, what I thought it would be fun is to share a case study with you on an organization, Mountain States Health Alliance, who has had great success in the use of pre-hire assessments. Mountain States Health Alliance is locally owned and based in Tennessee. They have approximately 9,000 employees, and they've grown significantly over the last couple of years. And as a matter of fact, in the first half of 2010, they actually onboarded 1,100 new hires, which surpassed the number of new hires for the entire fiscal year of the previous year. So in preparation for this rapid pace of hiring, HR leaders really took a hard look at their recruiting processes, because what they found was that in many cases managers had misjudged a candidate's fit for the role. I'm sure you've all experienced this. Well, what happened is that led to 30% turnover among their new hires in the first 12 months. And so to reduce new hire attrition, they implemented a new recruiting process and utilized a pre-hire assessment tool. So in 2010, what they did, and into 2011, was the first thing that they did was they had to create job descriptions that they could use to match an applicant's experience, skills, and qualifications, and then to ultimately select an assessment tool that could help them to make that match. And the way that this worked was upon filling out the job application, an applicant would complete an online assessment, this online assessment tool that they created. And if the applicant was a good match, which was determined by a 70% score or higher, then the resume was forwarded to the hiring manager for additional screening. And so what did this all mean for them? Well, they had great results from this program. The new assessment tool saved them a great deal of time and resources. The HR and managers, they no longer had to spend time reviewing and interviewing applicants who just weren't qualified to begin with. And then, as further evidenced by the tool, and as you can see in this chart, they reduced their turnover by as much as half, from a 33% turnover down to 15% turnover as a result of using this tool, which ultimately led to substantial savings in both their recruiting and onboarding costs, as well as their development costs of those individuals, because they were bringing on people who were actually qualified. So hopefully this short story really got your attention, and it can help you to understand the value of pre-hire assessment. So here's the agenda for the next hour. First, we're going to talk about what is pre-hire assessment. I'm sure you all have different ideas of what that means, and I think you'll see from mine and Charles' presentation that the definition is really probably more expansive than you would consider. We also talk about more so the value proposition around assessment and its role in delivering more predictive decision making. We'll share with you our 4-step assessment model in as much detail as we have in this hour. And then, of course, there's any time you use an assessment tool and make hiring decisions, there are legal considerations. And then, we just felt it wouldn't be right to talk about pre-hire assessment without then talking about what do you do with that information once someone is hired. How do you leverage that and make that the data even more valuable to the organization? And then we'll summarize and we'll open up for some questions and answers. So before I hand it over to Charles to talk to you about what pre-hire assessments are, I thought it would be nice to just give some context around how we view the world of assessment. We see assessment as an essential component of any talent acquisition strategy. And so this is our talent acquisition framework, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with since you're members and likely part of the talent acquisition organization within your companies. But you can see that assessment sits right smack dab in the middle of the recruiting process. And what you'll see from the four-step model is thinking about assessments doesn't begin at that stage. It really has to begin much earlier on, as even prior to your sourcing candidates, is really thinking about the jobs that you're hiring for and how, what are the skills and qualifications that you need and how will you make that determination if someone has those qualifications. So we really view the pre-hire assessment process as very foundational for talent acquisition overall, really providing you with meaningful data to help in making a good hiring decision, really providing a backbone onto which other TA functions can be linked. So looking at, how do you link your employment brand to your sourcing, to your screening, and then ultimately your hiring, selection and hiring. Really provides far greater insight into the ROI and the value of hiring good people because you have data that you can turn to from the assessment process and the testing and the scores and all that comes with that. It also ensures and provides you with some legal defensibility around your hiring process, particularly if you're using the tools consistently, which Charles will share with you. And then also ensures that you are hiring people that are a good fit, not only for the job, but for the organization, in terms of its culture, its values, and where the business is going. So with that, I'm going to hand this over to Charles, and he's going to give you a lot of information about pre-hire assessments.
Thank you very much, Kim. I really appreciate it, and thanks everybody for tuning in today. I know everybody's busy. This deck that I'm about to go through, or my portion of it, there's a lot of material here. One of the things I really try to do in these presentations is provide a good resource for folks to come back to. So I'll be moving relatively quickly through some of these slides, but you'll have the ability through your Bersin membership, I believe, to access them and a transcript of this conversation at a later date. So consider this some good reference material, and I'm going to go ahead and launch right in here to begin talking about what is pre-hire assessment. This is an area that I've been working in now for just about 2 decades, and it's been a really interesting ride. We've seen unprecedented levels of availability and access to really good quality tools. So that's the good news. I think that the bad news, it's not really bad news, but the challenge is really around making sure these tools are used correctly, right? Using the best test or tool in the world in the wrong situation is not going to yield optimal results. So you have to really understand what you're dealing with. So we'll go ahead and just move right into the general beginning question of what is assessment. And I think if you would talk to or ask people, especially in talent acquisition, what is pre-hire assessment, everyone comes up with the idea almost universally. It's a test. It's testing. We all hate testing. A lot of people, especially as applicants, people don't like it that much. But at the end of the day, testing is really not, or assessment is really not just about testing. In the eyes of the EEOC and the government here in the U.S., any tool that's used to evaluate and discriminate between applicants and make decisions about who's in and who's out can be seen as an assessment and are really subject to the same rules and regulations. But that being said, tests really are where we focus the most. Those tend to be what gets the most scrutiny, and they're kind of the mysterious part of the process too, in which people don't always fully understand what they are. But at the end of the day, we're really talking about any predictive information that's collected in the hiring process that's used to action on and make decisions. But we will focus mostly on testing and tests today. And what do assessments tell us? Why are we so eager to use these things, and what value do they have? And we'll get into a lot of that as we get along. But I think that really the paradigm, the idea that I want everyone to kind of focus on is the idea of predicting future performance. And how do we do that? We do that by measuring individuals on specific areas or specific what we call knowledges, skills, abilities, traits, what have you. We'll go over those in a little bit more detail later on. But the point of this slide is really to say that future performance is related to three key things about an applicant. What they can do, so what their raw abilities, I call it sometimes their mental horsepower, things like that. So that is obviously going to be an important factor. What have they done, their experience in the past, and what they bring to the table when they show up at your door. And then finally, and I think this is a really important piece, what do they want to do? The motivational aspect of things. Does someone actually fit in the work environment? Do they match the culture? I think everybody on this call can probably draw on a time in their career when they had the ability and they had the experience to do a job, but got into an environment where they didn't really fit in with that environment. And, if you're like me, you didn't last very long, because even though you could do what was being asked of you, you weren't really enjoying it very much. So that's really an important component that cannot be overlooked. And I talked a little bit about prediction, and I really think that's the main value proposition of assessment. That's how it works. The mechanism is scientifically based, reliable, valid, accurate tools that can help predict success and can help support informed decision making. So we'll talk about that a lot. And here we have another tried and true, analogy for assessment. I think it's really, really valuable, even though it's probably pretty obvious. With your typical non-assessment related process, you really get at the surface level stuff, but you really have trouble seeing what lies beneath the surface, the things about people's raw abilities, their motivations and values. And as we know, the part of the iceberg that's under the water is not only the biggest part, but it is the part that sinks the ship. It's the part that really can really cause problems. So it's very important to see how can we get a view or access what we really aren't able to see. And here is a slide that just really covers the value proposition again with assessment. These are some of the reasons why assessment can be such a valuable asset. Without any way to really evaluate applicants based on the things that are required to perform the job, you can have, especially in the case of high volume hiring, information overload. In the case of just relying on resumes, low quality sources of information, information that's not standardized, information where you may be looking at pieces of data that aren't even related to what's required for someone to do the job. And as soon as you are getting into that mindset, or into that groove, you're really going to miss some ability to do prediction in a good way. And we'll show you some visuals of what that looks like later on. When you have assessment, you're able to have an efficient process. You're able to focus on candidate quality. We know everybody talks about that. It's a very common theme now is, quality of hire. Without assessment, it's really difficult to understand your quality of hire. It really works from the entire employee life cycle, from hire to retire, or pre-hire to retire. And Kim will talk a little bit about the details of that at the end of the presentation. It really allows, from a strategic point for your business as well, it allows you to really invest in people that have what it takes to be successful in your organization and to catalog and understand those things so that you can manage them. Really, really important stuff. And then legal defensibility, especially here in the U.S. I've gotten a lot of pushback over the years, people saying, well, we're worried about the legal ramifications of using an assessment test. And my response is, look, if you use assessment correctly, you actually are supporting or enhancing your ability to defend your hiring process. A hiring process with no assessment or with a assessment that hasn't been put in place following the model that we're going to talk about here today is where you can run into more problems, actually. So that's kind of a myth that, assessments provide problems with legal defensibility. And, again, just a little bit more on the value proposition here. It's all about using science to help your individuals in your talent acquisition process make good quality decisions. Based on what? Well, based on knowing the job and measuring things that are important for that job. That's what really allows you to predict success. It's about as simple as that, even though when you get into the nuts and bolts of it, there's a lot of technical complexity around some areas. The bottom line is know the job, measure it properly, support your decision makers, and you're good to go. And so I think that's really an important viewpoint to take, that the value proposition is about helping make informed decisions. And now we'll get into a more detailed description of the four-step model that I use to really guide my advising and my practice with individuals who are, or organizations who are looking to use assessment. And I try to really boil it down into something that I feel like, is repeatable and actionable and understandable in a way that you don't have to be an IO psychologist. You don't have to have, poured through millions of boring books on this stuff to be able to get the gist of it. And just before we launch into the model itself, it is important for me because I'm someone who stands up on the soapbox and talks about how great these tools are all the time, and I think that I have no problem doing that, but I think it does require some dose of realism as well, right? Predicting what people are going to do is pretty much an impossible thing. I mean, I think that there's some universal truths. If you put a stack of money in front of somebody and give it to them, they're going to be happy. Beyond that, it drops off pretty significantly. We have so many contextual factors that can impact us, and so many things when you get in an organization about the for instance, the number one thing, and this is more anecdotally, but I would bet money on it. The number one reason people leave a job is that they don't like their direct boss, right? So you could have all these other pieces of fit in place, and if you're not happy working for one individual who's making your life miserable, then you might leave the organization or your performance might suffer. And so those are things that are harder to model. Or just think about, the fact that you might have a spouse who has to pick up and move to another city for their job, and you have to then leave your job. So there's so many reasons that people come and go or their performance may wane. To say that you can 100% accurately predict performance is really a fallacy. But the good news is that even at the levels that we're able to achieve by following a model like I'm going to show here and by using best practices, we can save the organization millions and millions of dollars. And I've seen it over and over again, and we have some examples as well. And Kim already shared, a really great example of a story of reducing turnover, which is a very common story for how effective assessment can be. So I think that's really an important check. And if you all are out there, navigating the world of vendors and listening to their pitches and things like that, if you start coming across vendors who claim that they can 100%, even 75, 80% of the time tell you, who's going to be successful through the use of their tool, that is a red flag, completely honestly. Those levels of predictive accuracy are really not achievable with the tools and technology that we have available to us in the present day. So without further ado, here's the model, and we'll go through each step of the in this model, but let's zoom out and take a quick look at our 4 steps. Are really defining what it is that's important for the job or for the organization, measuring it using quality tools, using the information that's yielded from the measurement process to make decisions, and then last but certainly not least is to evaluate the impact of decisions. And I'll tell you right now that step number 4 tends to be the step that people drop off or don't do. It's not the easiest step. It takes a little bit of extra effort, but you're never going to be able to go back and prove the impact of what you're doing. You'll never be able to build a business case for assessment and the value of assessment without completing step number 4. So, to get funding, to get credibility, to get strategic investment in assessment programs, you have to have that 4th step. It's really important. So moving into the first step, we're really just talking about defining the job performance domain, defining what it is that's important in a given situation. And, the idea you can't measure what you don't understand, I keep always coming back to that, right? So this is foundational stuff. And, the good news is it doesn't necessarily have to be something that's really difficult. Where does it start? Well, it really starts with the idea of linking what I call business and human terms, right? So it starts with strategy. It starts with how is hiring this individual going to add value to the organization and help it meet its goals? And you can look at those goals, and then you can start to track back, okay, well, what abilities and characteristics do people need to have to fulfill those goals? And then, really what behaviors do those characteristics generally drive on the job? So we can look at it very behaviorally, but it's also a kind of a model that you build that says to get here, here's what we need, and here's what people have to do. And that's really taken the time to study not only that strategic driver, but also, specific things. So I really look at this definition phase as a detective. I really try to put and I do a lot of this kind of work for organizations, and mostly along the job analysis line. So when you talk about this in the most traditional sense with an IO psychologist, you're talking about job analysis and the idea that you're studying a job. And these are a lot of different ways that you can define jobs. They range from being, really cursory and probably not that great, using a job description, which we know is generally a pretty poor piece of information, all the way to, a detailed job analysis study. At the end of the day, though, if I have my say in it, what I want to do is collect data from experts. We call them subject matter experts, and the people who supervise them. And we do that through a lot of different interactive ways, interviews, observing them, doing focus group surveys. But the whole idea is to continually collect data through a process that helps you understand people. And we IO psychologists most often do this as in the framework of a job analysis. And it uses those tools I just showed you and really provides a process. And it provides documentation, right? Documentation and the basic Lego set, the basic building blocks that you need to stack together to help you predict success for a particular job or even within a particular organization. And then the outcomes of that process, the building blocks are really, they vary, but generally it's a competency model. It's the idea in the more traditional sense of what my field knowledge, skills, abilities. It's business drivers. It could even be outcomes, saving this much money, increasing sales to this level, driving, more customer conversions, customer service, all that kind of stuff. And we'll look at some of those outcomes a little bit later once we get into the evaluation step. So we've now done what we've needed to do. We've worked with a vendor or worked by ourselves within our company to figure out what we want to measure. And now we have to build our measurement tool model. We have to put measurement tools in place that will allow us to be sure that we're getting quality measurements of the traits and things that we view to be important. So, and this is a really big step. And I tend to take a very process-focused view when we talk about this kind of stuff. I like to have tools staged, and you'll see an example of this coming up in a few slides, but I like to think about it as not just a test. I think traditionally people with my background are so darn into these tests. We're so, giddy about them because we build them and then we get to create, models and collect data and see how well they work. It's very exciting, but at the end of the day, a selection decision is not about just one test. It's about an entire process. And if you have one weak link in your process, then that's going to possibly cause, a problem. So let's take a little bit of a look at, what assessments look like. I think everyone probably has taken a pre-hire assessment in their day. Some of them more entertaining than others. But generally, as I said earlier, and, this is my reality, even though I'm into testing, people don't really love them. They tend to be things that give people anxiety. We've always heard this phrase, we don't test well. The irony of me being a test creator and test expert is that I honestly don't test very well, but that's okay because I don't have to take many of these things anymore. So anyway, I really feel like they're not dark and scary, but they're really challenging, insightful pieces of information that can help you provide wisdom and help you really build, some credibility. So to me, it's all about looking at these things in a mindset of the positive, and that's how I look at everything. So it's good. And again, just talking about the idea that we're looking at taking these pieces and configuring them in a way that each one feeds the next. And if you have a weak link in your process, if you have the best test in the world, but it's following a really bad sourcing process, then you know what? You're limiting its ability big time. So you have to think about it as a system. And we don't really have time on this call. It's a whole other webcast to go through all the different assessment tools and how they work. I'm just going to, throw the slide up here and let you kind of absorb this. I think, again, we've all experienced to some degree these various pieces of the process. And, they're all legitimate, viable ways to measure people. And, most systems you don't use every one of these, but you're gonna draw from these based on the situation and based on your charge. So moving to my second tried and true model beyond the iceberg is the funnel. And I think, again, everyone who's in talent acquisition is probably pretty familiar with this paradigm. And again, the funnel, in my mind, is really a layered or tiered endeavor where you start outside of the funnel and really say, look, if we really want to have the best probability of hiring someone who has X or Y characteristics, we better make sure that we're putting those people into the funnel, right? If you're not even sourcing people or trying to brand or appeal to people who have the mindset or tools or interests that you are looking for, you're never going to hire them on the other end. So it's a simple probability game, and that's why I feel like the branding and sourcing part of your talent acquisition is just so critical. It makes the test able to do their job so much better because you're providing good raw material. And again, I'm not going to go through every single test and how they work. I suggest you download a copy of the primer. There's a good amount of detail in there on this stuff. But the bottom line is we really move from the broad idea of screening people out of the process, so saying, look, these are people who clearly don't have the basic qualifications, clearly don't have what it takes, and at the same time starting to screen in and say, here's the people that really do have what it takes, and maybe we should invest in those people a little bit more and put them through a little bit more data collection and talk to them a little bit more and move them through the process. And so you're really moving, into a dialogue with a candidate, and you're putting up more ability for them to tell you about themselves and more ability for you to look at that versus what you feel is important and engage stakeholders, and then move to a process where you're really making offers and verifying people and moving into the onboarding. And we have a great graphic at the very end that Kim will show that shows you really the way that you can take this funnel and move and mate it up with the post-hire funnel to show a really nice, long process that really covers soup to nuts with employees. So this next slide is really just an example of what people like myself do when we lay out a selection system. Is we'll take the things we've measured in step one and we'll list those out, and then we'll take the tools that we have identified in step two and we'll map them. And you can imagine this graphic mapped onto a funnel, and you could see, that certain ones of these things are generally best placed in a certain order. And again, there's no hard, fast rules for this kind of stuff. It really, really depends on your situation. But this is the kind of thing, this and a funnel together, are what really provide you a great roadmap for, a hiring system. So moving on to the third step, making decisions with your information, right? And this is, again, my big thing that I really like to talk about is, and I've had a lot of pushback, one of the other specialties I have is really in the technology aspect of tools, hiring tools and selection tools. When I first started in this field, not even that long ago, honestly, my first job as an intern was to take test results off the fax machine and to put them into an Excel spreadsheet and then to run some macros and then email people. I was able to have email, which was great, to email people the results. So, I spent most of my day just scoring and doing admin work around testing, right? Well, now we can use technology to do all that stuff for us. It's a whole new world. And so really the decision-making process has become so much easier and data has become so much more accessible. It's really a wonderful time to be, involved in this kind of thing because we're able to really support our decision makers with expert information and really, again, critical. If you can have the best test in the world and if the end user, your hiring manager, your recruiter can't understand what it's saying, doesn't buy into it, throws it in the, and I can't tell you how many times I've gone into companies where there's a testing program and they go through all the motions and then the people don't use the test. Well, guess what? That's a huge waste. So the bottom line is you really need to support buy-in and decision-making. And so, informed decision-making is a really important thing to think about. And information really is power. And, why do I have a chicken in this slide? Well, the chicken is, if you think about, I don't know how many of y'all are aware of the chicken they had that picked stocks in the stock market. Well, that's my analogy here, is they found that, experts picking stocks didn't do any better than the chicken. And in my world, I think we can do better than the chicken by using, some information and not by using random chance. So I think that, it's a good way to think about these things as information is power. You want to get quality information. I think about an example, too, from my life that my hobby is cars. I'm really into cars. So, and I've always been really excited by, as a lot of people are, especially young boys, the more exotic, cool, fast cars. And when I went to buy my first car, my father is extremely analytical. He busted out the consumer guide and he showed me the car I wanted, had all the red circles in there, tons of data about why this was a terrible car to own. But it was the coolest one that I could afford, and it was, the one that I went out and bought, ignoring the data completely. And, guess what? I wasn't able to really enjoy that car because it was broken all the time, and I couldn't afford to fix it. So that's my personal example of, looking at the data and really embracing it, even if it tells you something that you don't want to know. Really important stuff. And when you get into a selection system, there's really ways to help your decision makers work, right? There's some decision-making strategies, and I don't want to go over them in too much of a detail, but they really run from having an automated decision where you're either in or out based on, some kind of algorithm, and that's usually for a high-volume situation, all the way to, people who are highly manually making decisions. And then there's also what we call knockouts, right? So those generally go in hand with automated stuff. And then a multi-hurdles where you might have some knockouts, some automated, and some manual. So there's a lot of different ways to do it, but the bottom line is it boils down to who's making the decision. Is it a computer? Is it a hiring manager? There's value sometimes in both. And now, how do we support decision making in this age of high technology and instant information access? It looks a lot different than the situation I described when I was an intern 15, 20 years ago. And I've got a couple screenshots here, 5 or 6 in a row, and please don't get too hung up on trying to really look at the nitty-gritty details of the information that's here. Take a step back from your computer screen and look at it from a broad perspective, right? How do people make decisions in the hiring process? What technology systems support that? Well, obviously, applicant tracking is a really good one, and that's kind of the highest level, what we find a lot of times with assessment is that assessment providers, especially at the enterprise level, will integrate their applicant tracking. Their assessment results will be integrated into this dashboard, right? So you'll have a bunch of data about somebody and then just one little assessment score. And that is generally worthwhile, but what we find is we can dig a little bit more deeply and look at a couple different things. This is an assessment report. This is what you might see as a static PDF that you would get from someone who has gone through an assessment process. Again, please don't fry your eyes trying to read this. What I'd like you to do is look at the fact that what you have here is a very high-level pass-fail thing. Here's the percentage of fit this person has. Here's their red, yellow, green kind of, pass-fail. And then here's the critical competencies for the job and where they stand on it. And that's generally what you found, especially in days past, very typical fare for assessment results. But nowadays, we also have the ability to have what I call a candidate management or assessment management platform, where you're able to do some light ATS type things, but you've also got, if you see here, you've got a workflow, you've got a rec for someone, and you've got, red, yellow, green across different measurements in the process. So you're tracking someone through a process and also comparing them in a stacked rank way to other people going through the process. And from there, you can really drill down. This is a dashboard type system, very common. Almost every assessment provider has something like this. So you can go from that last view now to a very detailed view of individual competencies and where that person fits on those competencies. And then even from there into a more detailed narrative view where you can start understanding, what does this really mean? Some people don't even focus on this stuff. It's not valuable to them. Others, they're really, really into it and it's important to them. So I guess the bottom line is we've got the ability to slice and dice and segment information in all kind of different ways now to support people who are making hiring decisions, and it's really a wonderful thing. Again, I've talked a lot about informed decision-making and empowering your talent acquisition folks to use that information, and this is really where I'm wrapping that up in this slide. I talk about the various pushbacks I've had over my career. Well, one of the biggest ones has been, hey, I don't want a machine making a hiring decision for me, or we don't like to hire to the test. We like to have some ability to have some leeway. There's a lot of different things. But the bottom line is, however it works for you, whatever formula you set up as an organization, the bottom line is you've got to look at it as a way that your people are ultimately who make the difference in your hiring process. The people that are helping make decisions. So the whole goal, again, I hope I don't sound like I'm, beating a dead horse here, but the whole goal is just informed decision making and being realistic about the value of the information you're getting and looking at it in the context of all the other stuff that you're collecting in the hiring process, going back to the idea that assessment isn't just one test. It's a whole bunch of things and a collective data picture that you build. So now we're on to the fourth final step of evaluating the impact of your selection decision. I like to look at it as a Six Sigma type thing, right? In Six Sigma, it's critical that you measure and then learn from what you've measured and then go back and adjust your process. And this is no different. Without that learning, you don't know what's going on. This is also where the money lies. This really is the way that you prove the value proposition, that you show the money. And there is money, believe me, if you do it right. And how is there money? Well, one of the ways there's money is the idea of differentiation. I talked about it a little bit earlier in the funnel model. Imagine, if you look at this, you can see assessment really works for you in two ways simultaneously. Not only does it screen out your bottom 20%, and you've got some kind of dummy production figures here, but the point is that imagine if you could screen out the people who are basically having half the output as the top people and know that you can identify the people who are going to be at the top and move those people through. Just think about the value you get, right? And when we talk about the concept of validity, the validity really is what focuses on, which proves its value, and I'll talk about it a little bit more. Validity is a concept that I think is often very misused, and people put too much weight into it, even though it is important. And I don't have enough time on this call, again, a whole separate webcast to talk about validity and what it is and how to use it. I've got some slides here that just kind of cover the basics, but it's not something to be scared of, that's for sure. Validation really is the idea of making sure the test is measuring what it takes to do the job. It's another word for it would be accuracy. That's another synonym for validation, and there's a lot of different ways to do it. Again, don't want to get too detailed on these ways, but they boil down to either you do a job analysis and you document through subject matter experts what's important on the job, or you do an actual empirical study where you collect data, test data and performance data and look at the relationship, or you can actually do kind of the quick fix, which is to look at how a test has worked in a different situation and prove your current situation is the same. These are all three viable strategies, and they're all three strategies that can work hand in hand. But at the end of the day, what validation looks like is this slide here. You've got a predictor, which is your test. You've got a criterion, which is job performance. And the real value is when the test actually measures what's important for the job, as you can see in the third scenario, that's where the value is returned. If you have a test that has nothing to do with the job, you're not going to have any validity and any ability to really turn any outcomes that are above and beyond random chance. And so, you know, these Venn diagrams really show it very well, and this next slide shows another example, and don't be off-put by this, but it's really just looking at the idea that you can collect some kind of criteria, some job performance ratings. You can collect your test scores and find the fact that the people who tend to cluster around this line of higher scores tend to have higher job performance, and that's what validity is all about. There are other forms of evaluation beyond that classical IO psychologist test validation model, which focus on really qualitative information as well, right? How do the candidates like the process? What do the hiring managers think about the process? What do other people do in my industry? You know, so those are all important ways to evaluate. And evaluation is really a big picture thing that ends up leaving us with some really, really valuable outcomes. You know, reducing turnover, increasing sales, customer satisfaction, and then some less tangible things that have to do more with the long haul around bench strength and development and leadership, you know, capacity, building your organizational knowledge base internally. So lots of stuff that you may not be able to measure very easily, but yet are very important. This next slide is just an example from an assessment provider of some of the things that they've been able to do for their clients. You can see just a lot of things here that you could look at and say, hey, these are things that really have real dollar values at the end of the day. And even a broader thing that now we're entering into this age of talent analytics and big data where we have so much data that we can mine and slice and dice and start looking at some of these other kind of questions around the bigger business pictures and really start doing a lot of hypothesis testing, but also just, you know, throwing stuff to the wall and seeing what sticks, you know, and learning through data about the impact of our hiring process. Big stuff, really exciting stuff. And so now I'll just talk really briefly about legal compliance. I think legal compliance is a really important thing to, you know, keep in mind, and it's really a matter of risk tolerance. Many organizations have a much higher level of risk tolerance than others do. I work for banks. They have very, very low risk tolerance. You know, I work for IT companies. A lot of times I don't care. But at the end of the day, legal defensibility, the number one thing is that your test has to be job related. And I just spent the last 35 minutes telling you about how to make sure that is and why that's important. It's also about making sure that your process is standardized. Everybody has to be given the same chance, right? Applicants need to be able to go through a process that they can enjoy and understand and be knowing that they're being evaluated with the same exact footing as someone else, whether they're purple, plaid, blue, green, polka dotted, doesn't matter. They need to be treated the same. And that's really where people end up having problems. And then documentation. If you don't document stuff, if you get called into court by the EEOC and you don't have a documented job analysis, you don't have a documented validation study, you don't have documented interview notes from all the interviews, you're never going to be able to win. You have to be able to collect that documentation throughout the entire process that supports the fact that you understand what legal compliance is and that you've been, actioning and executing on that stuff. So that was a rapid, wild ride through a lot of information. I hope I didn't overwhelm everybody. And now I'll turn it back over to Kim so that she can, talk a little bit about the post-hire linkage of assessments to pre-hire, and then we'll take some questions.
Great. Thanks, Charles. Hi, everyone. So as I said earlier, we really felt that to really get the fullest value out of your pre-hire assessment process and the information that you receive is to not stop when someone is hired and just put that information aside and never look at it again, but to take that information and now use it so that you can make better decisions around the how to manage this employee from a talent perspective. This is a model that we've created that really takes the framework type approach, which we have for all of our practices, and shows how the talent acquisition process, and you can see on the left sort of that funnel, the steps that go with talent acquisition, and how that then funnels into the other talent management processes, and how do you gather that information now? So you have this information that's stored in the ATS. How does it get used in your talent management system or your HRIS system? How is it used for development? It's taking those first steps of onboarding and saying, okay, we already have a good amount of information about this person. So let's make sure that the right people have that information so that this person's career immediately can start to flourish and we can get the most value from this person's employment with us. So if we look at the individual ways in which we can look at that, if you think about performance management, the information that you get from that assessment tool immediately provides the new hiring manager a baseline of information from that performance so that now when they look and have a conversation about performance improvement, they understand what they're trying to improve from and where they're trying to get to, which can be more realistic for the employee. For career management, it obviously allows information for that employee to now understand about themselves and to understand, in order to achieve their career goals, what are some of the gaps that they need to fill. From an L&D perspective, certainly a way to improve onboarding. So onboarding is not one size fits all. We're not talking about orientation, right? But we're talking about how do you ensure that that person joins the organization and becomes fully productive as quickly as possible. And that can be used also for internal applicants. So this is not just people, by the way, coming from the outside. All of this type of information can be used for any internal employee who applies for the job and goes through the assessment process as well. For leadership development, you're able to make decisions around high potential designation. Based on their test score, they're joining the organization. This is someone you want to keep an eye on because you feel that that person has potential to really grow inside the company. And oh, by the way, we didn't hire them into a leadership position, but we think that they have the potential to become a manager or a leader of people at some point in the future. And then, of course, succession management. What a great way to immediately start looking at new talent coming in the door and thinking about how they fit into your succession plan for future roles with that align to their career, but also that helps to drive the business forward. So with that, let me just summarize. So Charles shared with you the four-step model. Define, measure, decide, and evaluate. We did this at a high level today, and I'm going to share with you what this report series is going to look like, but you're going to see that we have a lot more detailed information that will fill in a lot of the blanks or a lot of the questions that you may have thought of today. And by the way, if you have questions, be sure to submit them because Charles is here to answer your questions. We also shared what assessments cannot do, which is just as important as what they can do. So really recognizing that it's not going to give you everything that you need to know about the applicant. It's not going to solve all your problems and help you to make every decision that you need to make about hiring. It won't be 100% guaranteed that this new hire is going to be effective, but we do support and fully believe that it will help make it more effective for sure. And as Charles noted at the very end of his presentation, it does not take the place of an expert who sees the big picture, which is the hiring manager or the recruiter who is looking at multiple pieces of input to make that hiring decision. But what it can do is it provides you with extra data points about the applicant, information that you may not have gotten and likely would not have gotten if you hadn't done an assessment, provides a standardized way to gain insight into your applicants and consistent, provides a way to support quality of hire. I know that everyone on this call today is looking to improve the quality of hire. It's a common metric that organizations look at in terms of their talent acquisition strategy. It provides some supporting evidence for trends in an applicant's data. So, they may have said this in an interview. Does the assessment support that? It helps to identify, as I mentioned, development needs from day one. So whether it's through onboarding or through L&D, but from day one you can start to make that person even more highly effective for the organization. It weeds out your worst applicants, which that in and of itself is a huge win for most organizations today, are just being flooded with resumes and applicants. And at the end of the day, provides you information in order to realize ROI for the organization and be able to demonstrate that ROI for your business leaders. And at the end of the day, any organization that uses assessments is differentiating themselves from those organizations who do not. It really does give you a leg up in the process. And, it's not perfect, but it definitely adds value and gives you more information to make better decisions. So here's the series that's coming out. The Prehire Assessment Primer, which is what this presentation was based on, was published today. Then what we have is we have a report for each of the 4 steps that will go into detail of those 4 steps. So defining, measuring, making the hiring decisions, and then evaluating the business impact. All 4 of those you'll see in much more detail in the reports to come in the following weeks. I believe the entire series, it will be published before the end of January, so you'll see a new one published every few weeks, every 2 to 3 weeks between now and then. And then also in addition to that series, we've got some tools that you can take advantage of. We have a tool that will help, a checklist for conducting a job analysis. So that first step in defining the job requirements, we have a tool that goes with that. We have a tool around developing an assessment strategy. So report number 2, how do you, Charles shared that number of assessment tools that are available, and then he shared an example of how you can map the use of assessments to uncovering different qualifications for the job at different stages of the hiring process. A basic strategy for legal compliance. Again, another report that goes into a little bit more detail than just the one slide that you saw here today. Practical tips for getting started. Where do you begin in using pre-hire assessments? There are 6 dimensions in that report, in that toolkit, and we actually share 20 specific tips for getting started within those 6 dimensions. And then looking at, as I presented at the very end here, how do you take that information most effectively and to use it into your talent management process now that that person has been hired. So with that, we are going to open, if I can get to the next slide. It's not moving. Oh, I guess that's why. We have a survey for you to do while we're doing some Q&A. So we have a question that's come in, and so Charles, I'm going to ask you that. Which assessments are the best predictors of future performance?
Right. That's a great question. It's also one that's, I would have to say immediately what pops in my mind is it depends. I think that you have to understand what performance is, because different assessments are what you mean by performance. Different assessments are better predictors of certain kinds of performance than others. That being said, the purest and most traditional view in my field is really, really honestly the idea that cognitive ability, measuring somebody's smarts, their intelligence, is generally the most effective way. If you had to only choose one thing, it would be that. I feel like, I try to avoid the extremes in any situation or being in a mindset that there's only one way to do things. There's drawbacks for cognitive ability in that it shows adverse impact sometimes against protected classes, which makes it more complex to use from a legal standpoint. So there's a give and take. There's a trade-off there. You know, I feel very strongly about simulations. You know, there's an idea that, and I didn't have time to fully go into it in that model, the slide with the Venn diagrams, but the example of a typist is a really good one, right? If you want to hire a good typist, for the most part, give them a typing test. I mean, that's a really good way to see how fast they can type with how many errors, which is a key piece of the job, right? So any kind of simulation where you can make a miniature replica of the job in the hiring process. In factories, we see it a lot where workers will actually, or applicants will actually have to go through a series of tests where they have to actually assemble things, and they're graded on how well they do that, and people who do it really well have the dexterity and the focus, you know, probably to be better performers. In the call center space, because, you know, call centers are very easily replicated in a computer environment, very, very common place where we see assessments. In a contact center, you'll have a contact center assessment where the applicant will put on a headset. The applicant will sit there and actually listen to incoming calls and that are recorded and answer questions and, you know, pull information from databases, and everything's measured and evaluated. So an excellent, excellent way to do it. So if I had to pick my very favorite method, it would be a simulation. The downside of those is that they're expensive to create, and you know, they don't work as well for every job. The more complicated a job, if you have a mid-level marketing manager, it's not as easy to simulate their job, although you do have things like an inbox exercise where someone, or, you know, in more of an assessment center methodology, which tends to be used more for managerial things where you put people through real business cases that they would do. That's a simulation too. So I guess my answer would be, if I had to pick my all-time favorite, it would be a simulation.
Okay. Great, Charles. Another question is, how would an assessment strategy differ for something like a typist or maybe an individual contributor, you know, professional worker, compared to someone at a more senior level? I would imagine just personally that the investment might differ, so therefore you could do something like a simulation. But what do you see in terms of the degree of sort of sophistication of an assessment strategy and how that would differ?
Right. It's a great question. You know, honestly, look, my viewpoint is this. We really know that entry-level kind of hourly contributor jobs, they're simpler jobs. Not to take anything away from those jobs. I've done a lot of them. They're challenging, but the bottom line is if someone can show up for work, is not going to steal, can add and subtract, and is going to be nice to people, that covers, you know, 60% of the jobs in the whole U.S. probably. So, you know, we've got a ton of data. The performance model is pretty simple, and it's easy. As you move to a more complicated job, like an executive-type job at the other end of the spectrum, you know, they've got to do a lot of very complex things, and their ability to do the job is a delicate interplay of a lot of different competencies. So there's not usually any one thing or two things that make or break someone. It's the combination of things, and it's much more difficult to gain insight into that combination. It's just, you know, I liken it to a pie. The job performance pie for entry-level people is sliced into 4 slices, you know, 4 big slices. For an executive, there's 12 slices or 14 slices, and so each one of them is smaller, but they're all part of the whole. So, you know, you're right, Kim. To get at that, you need a more expert methodology. You need to invest more time and energy in measuring that person. It usually costs more money. But you know what? The upside and the downside are more significant. You know, with an executive, a bad hire can cost you millions, you know, one bad hire, whereas generally that doesn't happen with hourly workers, you know, unless it's what we call a catastrophic hire. So the models are different, and it's really important to, you know, to understand that going into the process and to make sure you're aligned in terms of just the basics of how you're going about it.
Okay, great. I'm looking at the time, and we are at the top of the hour. I wanted to stress a couple of points that I heard that I think is really important when thinking about assessments. I think number one is that the job defining the job is so critical. I mean, if you don't do that step, you're just setting yourself up to fail, because how do you know what to measure if you're not even defining the job effectively? So I think when people think about assessments, they immediately think about selecting the tool. So I would encourage everyone on the call to really think first about how well your jobs are defined. And then secondly is that when you think about assessment, it isn't just about the tests that you take. That when you're assessing a candidate, it's about all the information that you're getting in, whether it's through an interview, that's information that you're gathering, or it's even on the back end through background checks or drug screening, that's information that you're getting, so that's part of an assessment. It's not just that sort of, what most people traditionally think about assessment, which is a test of some kind to demonstrate either, competence for the job or potential for some other future role in the company. Any closing thoughts from you, Charles?
No, I think you hit the nail on the head, Kim. That's excellent. I just would, I encourage people at the end of the day just not to be afraid of this stuff, but to, educate yourself a little bit and then be able to really go out. There's never been a better time than now to find all kinds of really, really exciting, options for this kind of stuff.
Right.
Great. Thank you so much, Kim and Charles. That was a great presentation, a lot of great information, and thank you, audience, so much for taking the time to join us today and for participating with your questions. We really like to get the questions in so we can hear your thoughts. So thank you very much for that, and thank you for joining us. As I stated in the beginning, this webinar is being recorded, so it will be available to members in the research library along with the slide deck. And